World War II was unprecedented not only in the number of casualties but also in the number of military personnel taken prisoner. Of course, the largest number of them was on the Eastern Front. But while dozens of scientific articles and books have been written about the fate of Red Army prisoners, which was most often tragic, much less is known about German soldiers in Soviet captivity. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the topic of German prisoners was practically forbidden. Although, of course, everyone knew very well how widely they were involved in the post-war reconstruction of the country. Although Soviet historians strongly condemned the Nazis for their treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, they didn't even mention that during the war, crimes against humanity occurred on both sides of the front. So in this episode, we'll talk about how many German soldiers went through Soviet captivity, how they were kept, and what they did. You'll also find out how many German prisoners returned home and how they were received there. My name is Semyon, and I declare the section How Did They Live? Open. Let's begin. So how many were there? The war started disastrously for the Soviet Union. By late 1941, over 3.5 million Red Army soldiers were captured by the Germans, who themselves rarely surrendered early in the war. The Red Army captured a significant number of prisoners only as a result of the Battle of Stalingrad and the subsequent counter-offensive. Most German servicemen were captured by the Soviets in late 1944 and early 1945 as defeated Wehrmacht units surrendered. Now, regarding the numbers, we do not know, and most likely will never know, how many German soldiers and officers went through Soviet captivity, because the estimates from both sides differ enormously. German data shows that during the war, 3.5 million Germans were captured by the Soviets, and over 1 million never returned. Soviet sources state that under 2.4 million German servicemen were captured between June 1941 and May 1945. That is, the difference is more than 1 million people. There are both objective and subjective reasons for such discrepancies. Often, German prisoners tried to pass themselves off as servicemen of other nationalities, and the number of such cases reached tens of thousands. The main reason for data discrepancies is poor record-keeping and confusion in Soviet statistics. Even the internal documents of the VDSR regarding the number of prisoners contradicted each other, and sometimes the difference amounted to several 100,000 people. Here, it's important to understand that after being captured, not all German soldiers, and certainly not immediately, ended up in People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs camps. First, they were held at assembly points, then in temporary army camps, and only from there were they transferred to the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Sometimes this journey took many months. During this time, the number of prisoners decreased: executions, death from wounds or diseases, escapes, suicides. Some of the prisoners of war were released right at the front. In addition, there was a lot of confusion caused by the registration of prisoners belonging to other German formations, Volkssturm, SS, construction units. Modern Russian historians believe that between 3 and 3.8 million German prisoners of war and internees ended up in Soviet camps. How were German prisoners of war kept? Modern Russian historians like to emphasize what they see as a fundamental difference between the Soviet and Nazi systems of handling prisoners. In Hitler's concentration camps, the regime reportedly killed captured Red Army soldiers through forced labor, starvation, and harsh discipline. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, things were different. They treated prisoners humanely and didn't try to kill them by neglect. This is a rather controversial belief because the conditions for German prisoners were just as terrible, especially in the first years of the war and immediately after it ended. Here are some numbers to support my point. By May 1, 1943, more than 292,000 German and Allied servicemen had been taken prisoner. And by that date, May 1, 1943, more than 196,000 of them had died. Even before the war began, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs system of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had established the UPVI, the Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees, which later became the main directorate. Main Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees. In June 1941, it was in charge of 8 camps, and another 30 were to be set up according to mobilization plans. At the war's start, Soviet authorities closed and evacuated old prisoner of war camps deeper into the country instead of opening new ones. As of January 1, 1942, there were 8,925 people held in the 6 active camps of the UPVY, most of whom had been captured during the Battle of Moscow. A few words about the legal status. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics did not sign the Geneva Convention on the Protection of Prisoners of War from 1929. And their situation was regulated by a special decree of the Council of People's Commissars, adopted on July 1, 1941. According to this document, prisoners of war were guaranteed medical assistance on the same basis as Soviet servicemen, treatment appropriate to their status, correspondence with relatives, receiving parcels, and even money transfers from home. All of this, of course, sounds wonderful, but the problem is that none of it was actually carried out. For example, the Soviet Union refused to exchange lists of prisoners of war through the International Red Cross, which is considered the main condition for them to receive help from home. And in December 1943, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics completely broke off all contacts with this organization. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the situation changed dramatically, and the number of prisoners increased many times over. It should be said that the fate of the soldiers who surrendered from the German group at Stalingrad was especially tragic. A huge crowd of exhausted, half-dressed and starving prisoners marched dozens of kilometers a day in winter, often spending the night in the open air. Moreover, the Germans were hardly fed, the mortality rate was enormous, and out of the prisoners taken at Stalingrad, no more than 6,000 people returned home. In General Serov's diary, there is an episode that shows how Soviet soldiers treated German prisoners. As he traveled the road, General Serov often saw German corpses. When he reached the large column of prisoners, he saw the escorting sergeant shoot prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion. When the general asked him who ordered him to do this, the escort replied that he decided to do it himself. Serov forbade shooting prisoners and ordered transport for the weak to the camp, but this did little to help. The prisoners were placed in some half-ruined stables where, without proper food and medical care, they began to die in large numbers. The bodies were thrown into huge pits, sprinkled with lime, and buried by tractors. By May 1945, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Red Army occupied territories, in Europe, there were already more than 140 camps operating, capable of holding over 1 million people. In 1946, their number reached 240, the highest number in their entire history. At that time, about 4 million prisoners of war from more than 30 countries were held there. The largest group were Germans, 50%, followed by the Japanese, 16%. If we talk about the conditions in the Main Directorate of Prisoner of War and Internee Affairs camps, in terms of internal regulations and regime, they were practically no different from those of the Gulag. And it's no wonder, since the leadership of Main Directorate of Prisoner of War and Internee Affairs consisted of personnel taken from the Gulag system. The only important difference was that there were no convicted criminals in Main Directorate of Prisoner of War and Internee Affairs who used to terrorize ordinary Soviet prisoners. In all other respects, it was the same as in other Soviet camps. Cold, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, diseases, hard labor, and abuse from the guards. It's not surprising that in some years the mortality rate among the prisoners reached 70%. Prisoners of war officially received daily rations of 400 g bread, 100 g fish, 100 g groats, 500 g vegetables and potatoes, and 20 g sugar. However, in reality, as always, this was only on paper, so that later they could use that paper to cover their own backs. That's why the prisoners were constantly hungry, and the food rations also depended on their work output. For example, in 1944, if you produced 50% of the work quota, you got 500 grams of bread. For 80%, the suppliers got 600 grams of bread, and for 80 to 100% of the quota, you got 700 grams. Constant hunger made people act like beasts. Former Wehrmacht soldiers would do anything for soup or bread. It became common for rival groups to form among the prisoners. There were fights, murders, thefts, and food was taken from the weakest. In especially difficult years, cases of cannibalism were also reported in Main Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees camps. There were escapes, riots, and even uprisings in the prisoner of war camps. For example, from 1943 to 1948, there were escapes from Main Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees camps. 11,403 prisoners escaped, 10,445 were recaptured, and 958 were killed. But 342 escapees got away. At the beginning of 1945, there was a major uprising in the prisoner of war camp near Minsk, the cause of which was poor nutrition. The Germans barricaded themselves in the barracks and took the guards hostage. The building had to be stormed with the use of artillery, resulting in the deaths of more than 100 prisoners. Working for the enemy. Not all German prisoners were immediately sent to camps. Some of them stayed at the front and cooperated with Soviet special services. Such people were usually used for propaganda among German troops. There were quite a few officers and even generals among them. Moreover, they often agreed to cooperate not for a better ration, but for ideological reasons. For example, one such person was Heinrich von Eisendel, a 20-year-old Luftwaffe lieutenant, the great-grandson of Bismarck himself, the first chancellor of the German Empire. In captivity, he abandoned his Nazi views, joined an anti-fascist group, and cooperated with Soviet special services. It should be noted that two anti-fascist organizations were created in the camps for German prisoners of war: Free Germany and the Union of German Officers. Their members often went to the front lines, where they used loudspeakers to urge their fellow countrymen to surrender. Sometimes they were even sent behind enemy lines into active German troops, where they also carried out propaganda work. Strangely enough, the re-recruited prisoners not only German soldiers and officers. The main German prisoner in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, of course, was the commander of the Sixth Army, General Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. He, along with the remnants of his troops, voluntarily surrendered on January 31, 1943, after being captured. Paulus lived in a sanatorium near Ivanovo with a personal chef, adjutant, and doctor. Despite this, Field Marshal Paulus flatly refused to cooperate with. Only after the execution of his close friend Erwin von Witzleben, who took part in the assassination attempt on Hitler, did Paulus change his position and become a staunch anti-fascist. He made statements urging German soldiers to stop fighting against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and to turn their weapons against the Nazi regime. Later, Paulus testified as a witness at the Nuremberg trials, causing a real hysteria in Himmler and Göring. However, not all German prisoners were lucky enough to work on the ideological front. Most of them atoned for their participation in the aggression against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics through hard labor. How did the German prisoners operate? At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin expressed his desire to use German prisoners for the reconstruction of destroyed Soviet cities and industry. He mentioned the figure of 4 million people. Developing this idea, a program was created in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that spoke about using the labor of prisoners of war for 10 years. However, it soon became clear that recruiting that many forced laborers from prisoners alone was nearly impossible. Then the Red Army began to intern citizens of German nationality in the territories it occupied, not only in Germany but also in Eastern Europe. As a result, 200,000 interned German civilians ended up in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, most of whom had never fought on the Eastern Front, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Germans worked all over the country, from the Far East to the Donbass. They labored in coal mines, rebuilt the destroyed Stalingrad and Kiev, built roads, dug canals, and worked at metallurgical, chemical, and oil industry enterprises. As a rule, they were organized into so-called labor battalions, numbering from 750 to 1,500 people. German prisoners made a significant contribution to rebuilding the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' post-war economy. At the beginning of 1947, every fifth worker in the construction of metallurgical enterprises was a prisoner of war, in the aviation industry almost every third, in the construction of power plants every sixth, and in the production of building materials every fourth. Entire cities were rebuilt by their hands: Minsk, Stalingrad, Kiev, Luhansk, Kharkiv. Prisoners of war extracted millions of tons of ore, coal, and stone, and harvested millions of cubic meters of timber. The Germans generally worked very well. Their work discipline even became proverbial and gave rise to a kind of meme. Of course, after all, it was the Germans who built it. Moreover, the Germans were amazed by the careless attitude of Russians toward work in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was the first time they encountered the concept of kultura. Prisoners were used not only for hard labor, highly qualified specialists were engaged in work according to their expertise. In October 1945, there were 581 scientists with doctoral and professorial degrees under special supervision in the GUPFE camps. German engineers, architects, and technologists were highly valued, with special working conditions created for them. Many moved to the so-called sharashkas, where conditions were much better than in the camps. And the Soviet authorities gladly used the services of German auto mechanics, furniture makers, and tailors, who often worked in camp workshops, for example, in the camp atelier. Employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, newspaper workers, artists from Moscow theaters, and even the writer Boris Polvoy ordered suits for themselves from the camp tailor. How did the German generals live? Although the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics didn't sign the Geneva Convention on Prisoner Treatment, it generally tried to appear decent. When it came to high-ranking officers, I already mentioned the living conditions of Field Marshal Paulus. But the most interesting thing is that he lived in a Leningrad sanatorium, which before the revolution had been a luxurious estate. They set up a sort of mini-camp for enemy generals and high-ranking officers. There lived 22 German, 6 Romanian, and 3 Italian generals, as well as dozens of colonels from the Wehrmacht and the armies of its allies, who had been defeated by the Red Army during the campaigns at Stalingrad and on the Don. Among them was Paulus. The prisoners were well fed, receiving bread, meat, vegetables, fish, eggs, butter, cheese, grains, tea, dried fruits, tobacco, and coffee. On holidays, they got pies and pastries. During their captivity, the prisoners gained an average of 3 kilograms in weight. Generals and colonels were only engaged in labor on a voluntary basis. However, they were quite willing to do so just to avoid becoming overweight. Prisoners. They were allowed to send 1 letter home per month, which was delivered through diplomatic channels. They had their own medical station with massage therapists and a dental office. In the warm season, the gentlemen officers played soccer and table tennis and even organized hunts for Field Marshal Paulus. The Soviet publicist Pavel Pryanikov, who visited the general's camp, described it briefly. It was simply some kind of paradise, even by peacetime standards. And it's hard to argue with him, especially considering how ordinary Soviet citizens lived at that time, working around the clock at military factories. The journey home for the German prisoners turned out to be a long one. It dragged on for a full 10 years. The last of the Wehrmacht soldiers left the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics only in 1956. However, for many of them, the return was not a joyful one. The old Germany, from which they went to the front, no longer existed. They returned to a new country. And not just one, but 2. The German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic of Germany. The cities were partially or completely destroyed. The economy was in deep crisis. For example, in the German Democratic Republic, ration cards were abolished only in 1958. The issue wasn't really about the economy. Former Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves caught between 2 eras. The older Germans tried their best to forget, while the new era was just beginning. Former prisoners of war were needed by no one. Moreover, they were a living reminder of the shame and horrors of the past. As for what they experienced during the war, that turned out to be their own personal matter. Not everyone was able to rebuild their lives from scratch. Another blow to the returning men was emancipation, which happened while they were fighting or in captivity. German women learned to manage on their own, earn a living, hold high positions, and raise children by themselves. Men were excluded, leading to a sharp rise in divorces, especially in the Federal Republic of Germany. It's not surprising that, according to the statistics of the city of Hamburg for the year 1954, the leading cause of death among those who returned from captivity was suicide, followed by heart attacks and strokes, and then alcohol-related problems. The average age of those who committed suicide was generally over 45 years old. Conclusion. Captivity is one of the most terrifying aspects of war. It cripples the psyche, and a soldier who returns from captivity will never be the same again. We know the tragic history of Soviet prisoners, but German soldiers in Soviet captivity are less known. Yes, the Germans were the aggressors in that war, but not all Wehrmacht soldiers were committed Nazis or went to fight of their own free will. Many were simply drafted, as they say about that war. It's important for everyone not to forget this fact.